Bad Bird presents The Second Chance Man, Episode 2.
As night fell, the group was quiet. Everyone appeared to be in varying states of shock. Ben silently withdrew to his bedroom. Justin and Lily spoke in low voices in the main room, but the conversation soon trailed off to silence. The nightly breeze washed in, and the sounds of rustling foliage formed a soothing contrast to the deadly silence in the cabin. Presently, the two friends went to bed. As Lily lay to sleep, her thoughts drifted to the events of the day. She felt a pang of loneliness as she thought about her two friends, one clinging to life in a hospital bed, the other likely confined to a cold concrete box. Her eyes had just begun to flutter closed when a disturbance outside brought her back to wakefulness. Lily sat up in her bed, listening to the strange noise. It had begun suddenly from outside the cabin walls, and sounded like someone's weight moving over rusty bed springs. She threw her robe on and emerged from her bedroom. The sound continued through the walls. She checked Justin's bedroom, but his door was closed. Lily shook her head with confused frustration as she drew near to Ben's bedroom. What now? Ben's door was open, and the room was empty. The sound seemed to be moving. Lily put on her flats and opened the front door. A cool gust of summer air brushed against her face as she stepped outside. The sound seemed to be fading away. Lily walked around the corner of the cabin, nearly tripping over a branch in the dark. When she regained her balance, she noticed a figure standing a short distance from the cabin. The night was completely still.
Ben?
Lily said the word quietly, tightening the robe around her waist. The figure was staring up. When Lily spoke, it turned and faced her.
Yeah, it's me.
Ben moved his gaze down to the ground.
Is everything okay? What are you doing out here?
Ben fidgeted.
Well, things are not great. Everything feels like it's falling apart.
His voice grew emotional.
With everything going on at home and then Aunt Kath. Now this? What the fuck is going on around here?
Lily felt a pang of empathy. She knew the recent events must be especially hard on her friend.
I know. What can I do to help?
Ben let out a long sigh.
I guess you're already helping. Just being here. Take a night walk with me?
Lily smiled and nodded. The two walked to the edge of the trees and began following a well-worn forest trail. As Ben and Lily walked quietly through the trees, the light from the crescent moon cut tiger stripes on the forest floor. It was a beautiful evening. Lily turned to comment on the moonlight when she noticed something. Ben's hand appeared to be bleeding. Lily grabbed his arm and held up his hand for inspection.
What the fuck is that?
Lily shouted. There, on his hand, was a deep, oozing mark of what appeared to be a human bite. Ben pulled his hand away and held it close to his breast.
It's nothing. It's just a scrape.
Lily noticed that Ben was sweating. A lot. His forehead glistened with beads of moisture. She took a step back from him, almost unconsciously. Ben slowly approached her.
Ben, just stop.
Lily held out her hands to ward him off.
Please, Lily, it's just a cut.
Ben continued to draw closer.
Please, stop coming closer. You're scaring me.
Ben reached out towards her. Lily was feeling a burning sensation to flee, to get somewhere safe. She didn't understand the impulse, but everything in her was screaming to run. Finally, she gave in. Wheeling suddenly on her heel, Lily shot off towards the cabin. Instantly, she heard Ben's heavy footsteps shaking the ground behind her. An involuntary scream escaped her as she felt the man gaining on her. At the same moment, Ben's arm looped around her throat and picked her up off the ground. She kicked and scratched, but the blows fell harmlessly off Ben's large frame. Her vision began to blur, and then everything went black. Lily slowly regained consciousness, feeling the cold of the night air. Glancing around, she realized she was still in the forest, in some kind of clearing, a small pasture perhaps. She was lying prone, propped up against a stump. Trying to move, she discovered that her hands were bound. She coughed several times. Her throat felt bruised, and it flashed with pain at the exertion. A distant sound suddenly began, and it appeared to be drawing towards the woman. The sound was like that of rusty springs, or an abandoned teeter-totter, seized from years of neglect. Something moved at the edge of the tree line. Lily struggled at her bindings. She tried to stand up, kicking and moaning in fear and desperation. A figure was approaching. Illuminated by the moonlight, it hobbled with a bizarre gait, side to side, like a large man walking on stilts. The sound was getting louder. Lily screamed in terror as the figure clumped to a stop at her feet. Justin woke up to the front door slamming open. He rubbed his eyes and swung his legs off the bed. As he made his way out to the living room, he observed Ben staggering into the cabin. The man was crying softly, and his breathing was halting and ragged. He muttered quietly to himself as he slowly made his way to the corner and slumped down to the ground. The man then dropped his head into his hands. Justin's heart began to race as he observed blood on Ben's shirt, hands, and face.
Ben, is something wrong?
The words landed strangely in the dark silence of the cabin. Ben laughed. He turned away and began to weep.
Everything.
Justin slowly circled the seated man, eyeing him with a sudden air of distrust.
Lily!
Justin called, turning his head towards the back hall. There was no answer. Only Ben's quiet sobs could be heard in the dark of the room.
Where is Lily?
Justin asked quietly, his heart beginning to race. Ben hunched over and let out a long, trailing groan.
Where is Lily?
Lily began to hyperventilate, closing her eyes to shut out the image. She felt a hand on her leg, breath in her face. She began to whimper, tears dropping off the tip of her nose. A warm mouth closed on the flesh of her arm. It gently teethed her muscle and began running a soft tongue up her arm to the neck. Lily opened her eyes and screeched. Small black eyes returned her gaze, hovering above a stretching, enormous smile. Justin shot out of the cabin door, scanning the clearing frantically. A woman's scream cut the evening stillness like a knife. He took off in the direction of the sound, branches cutting his face and hands as he crashed through the underbrush. Sounds of agony grew in intensity and pitch as Justin grew closer to the source. Screams, cries, pleas for help, for mercy rang through the trees. When Justin finally burst out into the clearing, all was quiet. The moonlight was beginning to disappear behind wispy cloud cover, and a low breeze suddenly began to tousle the long grass throughout the empty space. As Justin searched the clearing furtively, his eyes finally landed on something. A dark shape was on the ground near the tree line. As he approached, his footsteps in the clearing sounded as an unholy intrusion in the quiet of the forest. As he drew close to the form, his mouth dropped. There, lying prostrate on the ground, was Lily. Her skin was colored crimson. The robe that she had brought into the forest lay torn and soiled on the ground next to her. Tendrils of flesh fanned from the ends of her wrist, where her delicate hands had once been. Her face was caved in and nearly unrecognizable. The flesh of her abdomen was torn and partially dug out. Covering her remaining flesh were scores of oozing injuries, what appeared to be the deep imprints of human bites. Justin puked violently, took a breath, and then vomited it again. A sound from the trees made him suddenly alert. The night was quiet, and Justin scanned the tree line. The soft trilling of a night bird could be heard in the distance. Suddenly, a figure burst from the trees, loping towards him in a long, off-kilter stride. Justin screamed instinctively and fled. He winced as he entered the woods, branches striking him in the face and the body, but he did not slow. He ran for as long as he could, but his strength soon began to flag. He could hear the sounds of his pursuer, growing louder by the second. Whatever it was gaining on him. Suddenly, Justin saw a light up ahead. A house! He adjusted course and used every ounce of reserve strength to propel him towards the structure. He was drawing close when his foot suddenly caught on an exposed root. Justin tried to soften the fall with his hands, but he was too late. His head slammed into the base of a tree, his vision crowding with bright, sparkling lights. Heavy, creaking footsteps grew near, and Justin desperately cried out in fear. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. A scream erupted from the brush, followed by the crashing sound of impact. Justin slowly sat up and looked around. His pursuer was gone, and Shelby stood nearby, a deer rifle gripped in his hands.
Get the fuck up, boy. Get inside.
Justin scrambled to his feet and followed the old man to the cabin. Hurriedly, the old man turned and bolted the door behind them.
What is going on?
Justin panted as he collapsed into a chair near the fireplace.
What was that behind me? Did you get a look at it?
Shelby shook his head.
I saw it, but I don't know what the hell it was. We'll know soon. I called the cops when I first heard the screams.
Justin's breathing slowed, and he wiped his streaming eyes and nose on his sleeve.
Where's Ben?
Shelby suddenly asked. Justin let out a growl.
Back at the other cabin. He was covered in blood. None of this makes sense, man.
His voice caught. Swallowing, Justin continued.
He was not himself.
Shelby didn't reply immediately. He was staring at the cabin wall, and his eyes indicated that he was not present. A long moment passed before the old man started again. His tone was wistful and distant.
You know, Ben changed a lot from when he was a boy. He used to be such a clumsy dumbass. I never really thought he was going to go anywhere with his life.
Shelby went into a slow sit on a nearby chair.
Everything changed for him after that car wreck.
Justin's eyes were fixed on the door, but he turned to glance briefly at the old man.
Everything changed for him after that car wreck. Joseph, having that boy a year later, seemed to change him even more. He was too young to be a father, but he loved that child more than anything. He bought him every toy the kid wanted. But that damn boy really only cared about the one fucking contraption. He was always banging around on that patio. I mean, just day and night.
Justin looked askance at the old man.
I thought Joseph died in the car wreck. How was his son born a year later?
Shelby seemed confused and frustrated by the question.
Die? Car wrecks? No. What? No. Joe. My Joe. Too young. too young.
Shelby pressed on his temples tightly with both hands. A slow, ponderous noise began to circle Shelby's tiny cabin, the noise echoing through the walls like the sound of old, worn-out bed springs. A low chuckling rumbled outside, followed by heavy, taxed breathing. One of the cabin's side windows suddenly exploded inward, causing Shelby's golden retriever to jump and begin snarling and barking at the door. The sound outside suddenly ceased. Shelby turned back in surprise at the dog, and then gasped. The dog's eyes had rolled back into its head. Waves of drool leaked from the animal's sagging mouth, trickling down its front and pooling at its feet. A desperate whining accompanied this bizarre scene. The dog's eyes twitched around the room frenetically, until a violent spasm suddenly sent the animal's head into the wall, and began to seizure, knocking over furniture and flopping against the wood floor, screaming and yelping plaintively. Shelby and Justin stood frozen, watching the animal. Abruptly, it struggled to its feet, and with a flying leap, disappeared out the cabin window. A piercing shriek rang out, and then everything was quiet. Only the gentle rustling of the forest outside could be heard. The door began to shake, and loud pounding emanated through the small cabin as something, labored to force entry. Shelby staggered to his feet, picking up his rifle from where he had left it against the wall. With a shout, he leveled the weapon on the door and emptied the magazine. A gurgling scream cut the air between the thunderous rifle sounds. The gunfire stopped, only as the trigger pulled harmlessly against an empty chamber. The battered door swung open slowly, revealing an empty threshold and the darkness outside. Justin and Shelby stared wordlessly off into the black. The summer sun beat down on the forest canopy, but it was cool beneath. Ben was walking along the familiar forest path he had taken 1,000 times. He had walked it so many times, he felt he knew every stick, flower, bush, and tree. But suddenly, something curious caught his eye. An elegant purple and yellow flower sat curling atop a mound of forest debris, a species he didn't recognize. He approached the strange plant with wonder. But suddenly, a thought struck him. An old memory. A sickly sweet feeling of suspense began to grow in his belly. The boy inspected the mound, the flower, and the surrounding forest floor. Beneath a lush fern near the mound, he discovered an opening in the ground. A yawning hole, just large enough for a teen boy to fit. From there, a narrow tunnel led off underground. After a quick glance around, Ben slipped into the opening and began to make his way down the narrow tunnel, crawling on his hands and knees. Before long, the young man was moving in complete darkness. He could feel only the hard, moist earth beneath his fingertips, and the movement of cold air across his brow. Finally, the tunnel began to widen. A tiny pinprick of light became visible up ahead. After several minutes, the tunnel opened out into a forest landscape. Ben found himself standing in a narrow gully, lush with unfamiliar plants. A low hiss caught his attention, and a black, inky fog began to rise up from the ground. It pooled at knee height, lapping up against the walls of the gully like waves against a pier. In astonishment, Ben noticed something. A figure, seated at a low stone table in the middle of the gully, a distance away. A dark cloak shrouded any features, but Ben could observe long arms resting on the side of the table, arms with black carbon skin with a strange textured appearance. Ben began to approach with tentative reserve, the black mist swirling around his knees like eddies about a submerged log. Beneath the hood of the cloak, Ben began to see the glint of dark eyes, featureless orbs without a pupil. A large parchment was spread on the table before the figure, and the dark fingers gripped what appeared to be a black, pointed writing instrument.
Welcome.
The words were spoken in a low whisper. The figure opened his arms in beckoning, and Ben felt a chill travel down his spine. The hair on his arms stood.
I am Moreau the Animator. How will I change you?
Ben began to stammer, but was cut off by a hiss.
5 qualities you wish to possess. Choose with care.
Ben stood in surprise, but then slowly began to speak. In response, the dark pen moved with lightning speed. A shape started to take form on the parchment. Strong features, a muscular form. In a moment, the image was completed. Moreau raised his head and locked baleful eyes on Ben. He raised a long black finger, pointing beyond the young man to the tunnel opening. He hissed.
Go now and die.
Ben sat, hunched on the floor and crying softly to himself in the empty cabin. Distant screams and gunshots echoed through the forest. With a whimper, Ben twisted into the wall and clapped his hands over his ears. The sound faded, but Ben was frozen in this position for a long while. A subtle vibration began to travel up the seated man's legs. Footsteps approached. A heavy weight moving across the wood plank floor. Ben opened his eyes to a figure looming over him, a dark mass in the darkness, with spindle legs of steel and spring that ran aground into blistered, inflamed flesh of the thigh.
Why?
Ben cried softly.
Why couldn't you have just done as you were told?
He wept emotionally and closed his eyes in resignation.
Why?
Silence fell over the house. The figure raised a hand overhead, pausing for a second. Then it brought its hand down, burying a heavy instrument in Ben's forehead. The figure raised its hands once more and hacked, again and again, splattering blood on the windows and the walls of the cabin room. Crimson fluid began to puddle on the floor, trickling into the cracks between the planks like a carefully channeled desert stream. Turning, the figure clumped slowly out of the cabin, dripping blood from 4 rifle wounds in its abdomen. It moaned softly, laughing, crying. The creaking figure fell and lay still beneath the canopy of starlight. When the boy was born, he was a beautiful child. 8.5 pounds of smiling, babbling joy. Blonde hair, his mother's eyes. Ben named him Toby, after his own father. Ben was overwhelmed by the love he felt for the child, and Shelby was kind enough to let him move into the guest cabin down the road to raise the boy. The young mother was in no position to take on the responsibility of child rearing, and anyway, her parents had soon whisked her away to live in another town. The guest cabin was a sturdy, humble structure, and well secluded from the road. It was nice in an old-fashioned way. It had a concrete patio off to the side, and a large wooden deck in the back. Initially, Toby was a pleasure, happy and energetic. When he grew older, however, he began to display an unusual personality. As a toddler, he would torment Kath's cat endlessly, hitting it with sticks and even biting the poor creature's tail. The cat was an elderly, patient animal, and never lifted so much as a paw in defense. It did learn to avoid the child, however. Toby was even worse with other children. He would push, bite, and scratch to the point of blood. It wasn't long before the children avoided him as well. Then one day, Ben found the cat, poorly hidden under brush cover on the edge of the property. The animal's head was brutally disfigured, and the body was covered in bloody bite marks. Strips of fur were ripped from the corpse, the paws gnawed away. Ben went to find the boy, which wasn't difficult. Toby was almost always in the same place, playing on the patio. The boy hadn't even bothered to clean himself up afterwards. Covered in blood, head to toe, Toby was playing happily with a big smile on his red face. Ben felt his stomach turning in fear, horror, and regret. In an instant, Ben recognized that the child was sick. a sudden shard of fear passed through the man's breast, a fear that the child would be taken away when his sickness was recognized by others. Then, Ben had an idea. Perhaps the boy could be changed the way he had changed. With some simple coaching, the boy could be reborn anew. Ben would have his smiling, innocent boy back. He immediately washed the boy up and sat him down. Ben communicated his plan, what the boy must do. Toby listened wide-eyed, marveling at the idea of a magic man who could give him anything he wanted.
Here's what you will ask him for: pureness of heart, innocence, intelligence, beauty, talent. I want you to memorize these words, and we will practice every day for when you meet him.
Finally, the boy was ready. Toby could repeat the rehearsed words back without difficulty. Ben took him to the mound he had found so long ago. It was now greatly overgrown, but the flower was still there, though it had begun to wilt, its delicate leaves drooping to reveal a scattering of dropped petals on the ground. Ben showed the child to the tunnel entrance, and they began to crawl. Almost as soon as Ben had entered the tunnel, a feeling of dread set upon him. Claustrophobia, fear, terror. His heart raced, and it grew difficult to breathe. Finally, he could go no further. The boy seemed unafflicted and was surprised when Ben told him they had to go back. Toby let out an obnoxious scream and continued crawling. Ben tried to grab a hold of the boy, but he was too far ahead. Ben had to get out. He turned around and crawled back the way he had come. Once out of the hole, he instantly felt relief. But fear for his son's safety remained, so he waited pensively by the mouth of the tunnel. After an hour or so, Ben heard scratching from below. Toby's head popped up suddenly from the opening. Ben started in surprise and felt a flood of relief. He lifted the child out of the hole.
Did you see him, Moreau? Did you ask him what we practiced?
Ben looked anxiously into the boy's eyes. Toby nodded.
He told me not to come back.
Ben grabbed and held the boy close. The next morning, Ben took Toby out for a walk down to the lake. He was anxious, dreading the task before him. Ben knew he couldn't turn back now. The work had to be finished. When they got to the edge of the lake, the two stared out on the waters for a minute. It was a quiet morning. The breeze gently rustled the long grasses on the shore, and the lapping sound of the lake against the gravel was hypnotizing. Ben picked up Toby and forced him under the water. The boy kicked and scratched and gurgled as the man held him firmly under the surface. The struggle didn't last long. After a moment, the boy was still. Ben gently released the lifeless form and climbed out of the water. His breath was heavy as he wept silently, dropping his soaked body on the graveled shore. He scanned the water, looking for movement. The air was so still, and the forest around, deathly quiet. His eye suddenly caught at something. A cloud of black ink began to spread out from the boy's lifeless body. The corpse writhed and twitched, the ink obscuring the boy for just a moment, and then the water began to move. Splashing, arms, clawing for the surface. Someone stood up from the water. Something. Ben's eyes widened, and the blood rushed from his face. His breath stopped. A strange, rhythmic sound began as the figure sloshed through the water. Ben scrambled to his feet and rushed for the tree line. He ran, heedlessly crashing through the trees, never looking back. Four sheriff deputies crept quietly through the dark towards the cabin, guns drawn, noting the open door and the figure on the ground. The point man stopped at the prostrate figure and shone his flashlight down.
My God,
He whispered.
a fucking kid.
The other deputies passed him in careful formation and continued to the cabin, while the point man radioed back to the station. Inside, they found a bloody, gory mess. Crimson wounds obscured the features of the small man that lay dead against the wall. Toby stood, paralyzed with fear as the black fog pooled around his thighs. A low hiss came from the figure in black.
Welcome. I am Moreau the Animator. How shall I change you?
Toby fidgeted, looking at the ground. He spoke haltingly at first.
My dad says you can give me anything I want.
5 things you would change about yourself, and when you die, I will bring you back a new creation.
Toby looked up suddenly, a dark light in his eye.
I want to be able to make my dad do whatever I tell him.
Moreau began scribbling.
I want to be big.
Toby stopped and scratched his face. A smile lit up his childish features.
I want to be able to hurt animals just by thinking about it.
Moreau paused briefly, and then continued sketching. Now Toby was really searching. He remembered the cat, the physical pain he had endured to satisfy himself.
I want a great big mouth to be able to bite anything without it hurting me.
Moreau looked up briefly, and he appeared to be weighing options. The pen began to move again. Toby stood for a long time after, without speaking. A low hiss.
Your last change, boy.
I don't know what else to ask for.
Moreau laid the pen down and folded his long, carbon fingers.
Perhaps think of something that would just make you happy.
Toby thought for a bit. He thought of his favorite toy, and the hours he had spent on the patio, springing up and down tirelessly on that stick. He thought about how much fun it would be if he could do it all the time. Toby relayed his idea to Moreau, who listened attentively as the boy described his favorite pastime. Moreau picked up the pen and sketched rapidly, completing the portrait.
Go now and die.
This has been The Second Chance Man. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.